May 12, 1858, Western Oklahoma. A Comanche chief stirs between slumbers as the first light of dawn breaks over the vast plains. His family is nestled warmly inside their large lodge, expertly crafted to maintain comfort amidst the cool, early morning air. The fires for cooking are yet to be lit, and most of the people in the camp are still wrapped tightly in buffalo hide blankets, slowly beginning to wake. The sun is just peeking over the horizon, casting golden rays across the shimmering surface of the nearby stream, painting the world in a tranquil glow. This group of Comanche, known as the Quahati or Antelope Eaters, call this vast territory their own, territory that spans across what is now Oklahoma and northern Texas. This land, hard-won and fiercely defended over generations, holds a deep spiritual significance for them. It is a place of sacred connection to the earth and the sky. However, the peace they have known here has become increasingly elusive, as the expansion of Texas settlements has accelerated at an unprecedented pace, encroaching further into their ancestral homelands. For decades, the Comanche raids have been a defining feature of life on the southern plains, a strategic response to the growing settler presence. But in recent years, these raids have reached new heights in both frequency and intensity, driven by a desperation to preserve their way of life. To the settlers in Texas, these raids were a terrifying reminder of the strength and resilience of the Comanche people. Their ferocity was unmatched, and their ability to strike swiftly and decisively left entire communities devastated. Settlements in places like San Antonio and Austin, as well as remote homesteads across the frontier, had witnessed the brutal realities of Comanche warfare, with casualties on both sides mounting. The Comanche were not simply fighting for land, they were fighting for survival and the continuation of their culture. As the Comanche raids became more frequent and intense, they represented not only resistance, but also the spirit of a people unwilling to be erased from the history of their land. Countless homesteads, stretching along the edge of the Texas frontier, from the fertile river valleys to the rolling hills of farmsteads, and even the larger settlements like San Antonio and Austin, had borne witness to the horrors of Comanche raids. These communities felt the weight of the wrath from a force they could never truly understand, the relentless and efficient raiding machine of the Comanche. From the plains of Oklahoma to the deserts of northern Mexico, the Comanche had carved a path of resistance, a trail of violence that stalled settler expansion for decades. This was not mere conflict. It was a way of life for the Comanche, one deeply rooted in protecting their land, culture, and people. Even settlers from the hardened frontiers of places like Kentucky, Arkansas, and Virginia, who had faced dangers from various tribes, could not prepare themselves for the intensity and sheer ferocity of Comanche raids. These raids were unlike anything the settlers had known, violent, strategic, and devastating in their execution. Comanche raids were often quick, strategic, and designed to exploit vulnerabilities in their enemies, utilizing their knowledge of the terrain to launch attacks with overwhelming precision rather than relying purely on brutal force. While there were instances of atrocities during these raids, their true strength lay in their adaptability, mobility, and tactical prowess. Whole townships were abandoned in panic, forced to retreat under the weight of the constant threat of further Comanche raids. One of the notable images in the story is Iron Jacket, Pujihitswa, wearing a steel breastplate. The story suggests that this armor might have been a war trophy from a Spanish conquistador after a brutal, solitary battle on the frontier. However, in reality, the use of steel armor in combat was not a characteristic part of Comanche warfare. The Comanche, known for their agile and mobile tactics, typically relied on speed and light weaponry rather than heavy armor. The depiction of Iron Jacket wearing this armor may be more of a symbolic or legendary image, aimed at emphasizing his status as a fierce leader and warrior. Historically, the Comanche were not accustomed to wearing armor as a primary form of defense. Instead, they used their intimate knowledge of the terrain and their swift hit-and-run tactics to outmaneuver their enemies. While the story of Iron Jacket's armor is intriguing and adds a mythical element to his character, it is important to remember that it doesn't fully align with the Comanche's typical approach to warfare. The use of steel armor could be a symbolic element added for dramatic effect, but it was not a widespread practice among the Comanche people during their raids. While the true origin of the armor remains shrouded in uncertainty, its impact on Comanche warfare and raiding was undeniable. Not only did it transform Iron Jacket into a figure of terror, but it also afforded him a degree of protection against the weapons of his enemies. The Comanche, known for their agility and mastery of the plains, had never relied on armor like the settlers or Mexicans. But Iron Jacket's armor was something different, something that instilled fear in the hearts of those who opposed him. It made him seem invincible. This belief that Iron Jacket's armor could render him invulnerable to bullets was widely shared by his people, as well as by their enemies. This perception gave him an almost mythical status among both the Comanche and the settlers. His reputation grew within the tribe, bolstered by his success in recruiting warriors and leading successful raids to acquire horses and captives, an essential part of Comanche culture and survival. His raids, particularly in areas around what is now Brownwood, Texas, were swift and brutal. Settlers in the region, many of whose names are now lost to history, felt the full force of Comanche wrath. Iron Jacket and his warriors moved quickly through the Texas countryside, their raids marked by intense violence and precision. They would strike with overwhelming speed, leaving death and destruction in their wake before vanishing into the wilderness. After each successful raid, they would retreat north, back to their homeland, some 300 miles away, where they could regroup and prepare for the next wave of resistance. This cycle of attack and retreat was a testament to Comanche strategy, intelligent, fluid, and devastatingly effective. Iron Jacket and his fellow Quahati Comanche felt a sense of security deep within the vast expanses of the Great Plains, far from the encroaching settlements of the white man. They believed their position, nestled so far away from the Texas frontier, offered them an almost invincible advantage. The open prairies stretched endlessly before them, an unforgiving land that had long acted as a formidable barrier to any sustained settler expansion. To them, the plains were more than just land. They were a shield, a protector of their way of life. This assessment of their safety was not unfounded. The Great Plains, with its undulating grasslands and seemingly endless horizon, had proven impenetrable to most outsiders for generations. The landscape, stripped of easily visible resources, appeared barren and featureless to the untrained eye, offering little incentive to anyone unfamiliar with the terrain. But for those who called it home, like the Comanche, it was not only familiar but also essential for survival. While the settlers from Texas may have made occasional attempts to pursue Comanche raiders into the heart of these plains, the vast, open grasslands often led to disastrous results for them. More often than not, the would-be pursuers found themselves trapped, lost in the ocean of land, unable to navigate its sprawling expanse. Those who didn't perish from hunger or thirst at the mercy of the unforgiving elements were killed by Comanche warriors, who knew the terrain better than anyone. The raiders knew how to vanish into the endless sea of grass, evading capture with unmatched expertise. But despite their deep knowledge of the land and their mastery of the plains, Texans were learning. They began to adapt, studying the ways of the Comanche and their successful tactics. The Texan settlers, who had once been ill-prepared to fight on such vast and unpredictable terrain, were starting to understand the dynamics of the land they were trying to conquer. The Comanche's dominance, once unquestionable, would soon face the challenges posed by a new and growing adversary who was beginning to understand how to survive in the Great Plains. More specifically, the Texas Rangers had been learning. For decades, they had faced the Comanche, and though they had become one of the only forces to put up significant resistance to the rulers of the Southern Plains, they were far from invincible. Formed on October 17, 1835, the Texas Rangers began as a hybrid force of military personnel and law enforcement. Their purpose was clear: to combat the frequent raids from bandits, Mexican army forces, and above all, the relentless Comanche raiding parties. In the years between their formation in 1858, the Rangers had made significant strides. Their combat skills and tactics had evolved, and their organizational structure had become more efficient. Yet paradoxically, during the same period, They had also faced setbacks, making several significant missteps. Their casualty rates were alarmingly high, often nearing 50%, as they struggled to maintain control in the face of growing pressure on the frontier. Despite their growing experience, the Rangers faced constant challenges. They were perpetually underfunded, and their reputation fluctuated between being vilified and lionized in the press. They had disbanded and reformed multiple times, struggling to maintain a cohesive identity. Yet, as tensions escalated, the newly elected Texas governor, Hardin Richard Runnels, was under immense pressure to deliver on his campaign promises of ending the bloodshed on the Texas frontier. In response, he directed a force of Rangers to pursue any and all hostile native forces. On January 28, 1858, Governor Runnels sent an official dispatch to his hand-picked Ranger captain, the legendary John Salmon Ripford, with instructions clear and unwavering. I impress upon you the necessity of action and energy. Follow any trail and all the hostiles or suspected hostile Indians you may discover, and if possible, overtake and chastise them if unfriendly. Ford, well versed in frontier warfare, had expected such a directive and was fully prepared to follow through. His reputation and experience made him a key figure in this escalating conflict. Though John Salmon Ripford had spent much of the previous 6 years focusing on political and entrepreneurial ventures, his reputation as a seasoned, battle-hardened veteran remained unshaken. Born in South Carolina in 1815, Ford grew up in Tennessee before moving to Texas in 1836. There, he pursued a broad range of studies. He studied law, practiced medicine, and joined the Texas Mounted Rifles during the Texas Revolution. By the 1840s, Ford became a member of the Texas Rangers, riding alongside legendary figures like Bigfoot Wallace, Ben and Henry McCulloch, Matthew Old Paint Caldwell, and Jack Coffee Hayes. Together, they participated in some of the most brutal and violent confrontations on the frontier. Ford's experience was forged through bloodshed and survival. He famously lost a finger in a battle with the Comanche, and his life hung by a thread more than once. Ford earned his nickname Rip during the Mexican War, where he served as both a lieutenant and a medical officer. His grim task during that war was to notify families of the deaths of their loved ones, and it was during this time that his repeated signing of R.I.P., a practice stemming from his official signature, led to him being affectionately and somewhat morbidly known as Rip. In the years following, Ford made his home in Austin, where he became a respected figure known for his devout Sunday school teachings, his newspaper publishing, and his occasional work as a playwright. Yet, despite his forays into civilian life, the violence of the frontier was never far behind. By the summer of 1857, the escalating conflict with the Comanche once again called Ford back to the front lines. Ford and his Ranger contingent spent the winter at Fort Belknap, located northwest of what is now Dallas. Here, they honed their rapid-fire tactics, the only strategy that would allow them to survive the vast expanses of what was then known as Comancheria. Rip Ford was tasked with reinstilling the combat knowledge and fearless spirit of Jack Coffee Hayes, who had once led the Rangers in their lightning-fast head-on attacks, a tactic that had become legendary on the frontier. Many young Texas Rangers had met brutal ends in the years leading up to this moment, falling victim to Comanche tactical traps. Feigned retreats, designed to lure the Rangers into vulnerable positions, were a common strategy, and countless Rangers had been caught in these traps. Others had been ambushed in expertly planned, shockingly violent assaults, where the Comanche's knowledge of the terrain and guerrilla tactics made them nearly unstoppable. While Rip Ford worked tirelessly to prepare his Rangers for the brutal challenges ahead at Fort Belknap, a trusted Tonkawa scout named Kichi ventured out into the vast open expanses of the Northwest, beyond the safety of the fort. Kichi had been tasked with scouting the movements of the Comanche, who had been on the warpath. His mission was critical. The Rangers had been commissioned to hunt down and confront Comanche raiders, but without someone who understood the land and the tactics of the native warriors, the Rangers would have been left largely ineffective. It's a fact often overlooked but undeniable. Without the native scouts like Kichi, the Texas Rangers, even with their experience and training, would have been essentially powerless in their attempts to track and engage the Comanche. The plains were vast and unforgiving, and only those who had grown up with the land, like Kichi and other native scouts, truly understood how to move through it without leaving a trace. As Captain Ford waited anxiously for Kichi's return, he could only hope that the scout had found something useful, that he would bring back information that would guide the Rangers toward their quarry. The fate of his mission rested heavily on the success of this scout, who had long been the Rangers' key to tracking the elusive and ever-dangerous Comanche. In April, Kichi returned to Fort Belknap, bringing the news Rip Ford had long hoped for. Kichi had located a Comanche village far to the northwest, near the Canadian River, and if the Rangers moved quickly, they might have a chance to catch them off guard. On April 22nd, Ford and his Rangers left the relative safety of the fort and began their trek northward, following the Brazos River. Their initial force consisted of 102 men, along with 2 wagons, a field ambulance, and 15 pack mules. As they made their way to Cottonwood Springs, their numbers grew with the addition of Captain Shafley T. Ross and his contingent of 113 native warriors, mostly from the Tonkawa, Waco, Shawnee, Delaware, and Tawakoni tribes. These tribes, deeply affected by the Comanche's raids, had joined forces with the Rangers for this mission. By April 29th, they crossed the Red River, officially leaving the jurisdiction of Texas and entering what was known as Indian Country. The Rangers and their native allies had long been accustomed to traveling light on such expeditions, choosing to leave behind unnecessary supplies and focus instead on ammunition and weapons. This way of life was crucial for survival in such a hostile environment. For sustenance, much of their daily food came from the animals they hunted along the way. Deer and rabbit were common fare, but buffalo was highly prized, and in 1858 they were in plentiful supply. On May 10th, a group of scouts who had successfully killed a buffalo noticed something unsettling. Comanche arrowheads were lodged in the animal's flesh. This was a clear sign that Comanche hunters had been nearby. The buffalo, though it had narrowly escaped becoming their meal, had nearly fallen prey to the Comanche. It meant that the Comanche were close by, and the Rangers and their allies could feel the tension rising. The scouts fanned out across the countryside, searching for any signs of where the Comanche were camped. After some time, they returned with valuable information. They had spotted a Comanche hunting party and traced them to their camp near the Canadian River. The time for action had come. The Rangers and their allies had to move quickly before the Comanche realized they were being tracked. Meanwhile, only a few miles away, Iron Jacket slept in the warmth of his lodge, unaware that the Rangers and their native allies were preparing to strike. Ford wasted no time. He roused his men and their native allies, gathering them from their fitful slumbers in another cold camp. The tension in the air was palpable. The final confrontation was drawing near. As the Rangers and their native allies checked their weapons and saddled their horses, the native warriors among them wrapped their heads in strips of white cloth. This was a precaution designed to prevent any accidental friendly fire from the overzealous Texans who might mistake them for Comanche warriors in the heat of battle. The white cloths served as a clear signal to distinguish them from their enemies, especially in the confusion of a fast-paced, high-stakes confrontation. Kichi, their highly respected Tonkawa scout, had reported the location of 2 Comanche villages. The first was a small village with only 5 lodges, a relatively minor settlement. The second, much larger village, was situated across the river, home to around 350 warriors, not including the women and children who also accompanied the group. This village posed a much greater threat. The Rangers and their native allies, now fully aware of the scale of the challenge, broke camp quickly. They left behind their 2 wagons, the field ambulance, and the pack mules, all of which were entrusted to the care of a guard commanded by Captain William Ford, Rip Ford's 73-year-old father. The force then began its journey in the darkness of the early morning, rising to cover 6 miles as they moved toward the smaller village first. Their plan was to strike swiftly and decisively before the larger group of Comanche warriors had time to prepare. The stakes were high, and every decision made in those early hours would play a crucial role in the outcome of the battle to come. At 7 a.m., the chaos erupted. The initial charge was swift and brutal, as the Rangers and their native allies poured into the smaller Comanche village. The clash was fierce, and every warrior they encountered was killed or driven off, leaving behind a scene of destruction. However, 2 Comanche warriors managed to escape the onslaught. They rode hard, desperate to reach the larger village across the river, which was about 3 miles away. Rip Ford and his Rangers, along with most of their native allies, pursued them relentlessly, determined to cut them down before they could warn the larger Comanche settlement. But many of the Tonkawa, who had long suffered from Comanche raids, joined forces with the Rangers out of a deep-seated resentment and a desire for revenge. Their involvement was not necessarily due to a formal alliance, but rather a shared animosity that had festered over many years. The relationship between the native tribes in the region was far from uniform and was often influenced by historical grievances, rivalries, and the broader struggle for survival. While the Rangers and the majority of the native allies pressed on in the pursuit, many Tonkawa warriors turned back to loot, burn, and kill any Comanche they encountered along the way, seeking revenge for the atrocities their people had endured. As the sounds of the first village's destruction faded behind them, Ford and the remaining forces made their way across the Canadian River. The river proved a significant obstacle, and many had to dismount as they crossed. Some even found themselves stranded, their horses lost, leaving them to slog through the river on foot as they scrambled to catch up with their mounted comrades. They were in a race against time, hoping to reach the larger Comanche camp before the Comanche could regroup and mount a defense. But to their dismay, the 2 Comanche warriors who had escaped the smaller village did indeed reach the larger camp in time. They had warned their people of the Rangers' approach, and the Comanche were preparing for a counterattack. Iron Jacket had likely been warming himself by his morning campfire when the 2 Comanche riders burst into the camp, frantic and pleading for help. There was no time to waste. Without hesitation, the chief gathered his weapons, shouted orders for his children to assist his wives in preparing the camp to move, and donned his prized Spanish armor, the symbol of his legendary status. With his armor in place and his warriors rallied, Iron Jacket and his comrades mounted their horses, riding out of the village at full speed. Their intent was clear, not only to thwart the Ranger attack, but to kill any and all who dared to stand in their way. The Rangers' native allies had reached the village first, arriving a few hundred yards ahead of the Comanche, and were the first to face the brunt of the retaliation. Despite the Comanche's vaunted reputation for martial prowess, they were blindsided by a particular advantage held by their enemies, the Waco, Shawnee, Delaware, Tawakoni, and remaining Tonkawa warriors fighting alongside the Rangers. These native allies, often underestimated, were armed with powerful repeating rifles and 6-shot revolvers. While such weaponry was a given for the Rangers, it came as a shock to many of the Comanche that their native allies also wielded such formidable firepower. As the Rangers and their allies closed the gap with the Comanche, Rip Ford and his lieutenants urged them to fire at the oncoming Comanche warriors. The battle raged fiercely as both sides clashed in the open plains. Among the chaos, the Comanche were struck by a brutal reality. Despite their belief that Iron Jacket was invincible when wearing his famed armor, he and his horse were both felled in the ensuing gunfire. This moment of shock reverberated through the Comanche warriors, as many of them truly believed that Iron Jacket's armor had made him impervious to bullets. But in this fight, that belief was shattered. Confused and momentarily defeated, the surviving Comanche warriors fled back to their village. As they rushed to their camp, smashing into the village at full speed, the chaos erupted. Amid the din of screams, gunfire, and confusion, Rip Ford's Rangers would later recall him as calm and collected, even in the thick of battle. Ford did his best to impose some semblance of order on the chaos unfolding around him, but the fight soon devolved into a series of smaller, individual skirmishes scattered across an 18-square-mile stretch of land. After several hours of brutal yet sporadic fighting, the Rangers regrouped at the Comanche village. Ford hoped to assess the situation, take stock of his forces, and gather whatever loot they could before a Comanche counterattack could be mounted. Upon arriving at the village, however, Ford found Captain Shapley T. Ross, the nominal commander of the native allies who had joined the Rangers from the Brazos River, organizing the native forces into a battle line. Ross was insistent. A Comanche counterattack was coming sooner rather than later. As Ford surveyed his forces, he noticed that two of his youngest rangers, Privates Oliver Searcy and Robert Nichols, were unaccounted for. Almost as soon as their absence was noted, Oliver Searcy came running into camp, breathless. Between gasps of air, he informed Ford that he and Nichols had been among the rangers who had been forced to abandon their horses in the thick, treacherous mud of the Canadian River. Footbound, but still hungry for a fight, the young rangers had missed the initial volley that had felled the Great Iron Jacket. They had pursued the fleeing Comanche, chasing them northwest. But as often happened on the frontier, the young rangers soon found themselves surrounded by Comanche warriors, cut off from retreat. Nichols and Searcy had made a desperate dash for a set of ravines near the river, turning to fire at their pursuers when they could, trying to hold them off. Nichols, however, was overrun and killed, his life ending at the tip of Comanche lances. Despite his injuries, Searcy managed to reach the ravine, evading the Comanche in the labyrinthine terrain. After hiding for a time, he had managed to make his way back to camp, severely shaken both mentally and physically. Though his fighting for the day was done, the Comanche retaliation had only just begun. As Searcy's warning about the Comanche being close behind him reached the ears of every man in camp, Captain Ross spotted a group of mounted Comanche warriors charging toward them. Leading the group was a large, powerfully built young warrior. His name was Peta Nakona, the son of Iron Jacket, and a respected and formidable warrior in his own right. As Peta Nakona and his warriors skillfully maneuvered their ponies through a thicket on the edge of the bank, sloping down toward the river, Captain Shapley T. Ross met with Rip Ford and their native forces to discuss their next move. Ross was concerned that under the leadership of this new younger chief, the Comanche might be able to secure a position on the high ground behind the Rangers' newly captured campsite. However, one of his trusted Tonkawa scouts reassured him that there was no need to worry. The scout mounted his horse, armed only with a spear and shield, and rode boldly into the open ground between the Comanche and Ranger positions. What followed seemed almost as unbelievable to the Rangers present as a scene from medieval antiquity. The lone Tonkawa scout began shouting taunts at the Comanche warriors stationed high on the ridge, drawing their attention away from the Rangers. For over half an hour, the Comanche and the native allies of the Rangers engaged in a unique battle of taunts, followed by charges and bouts of hand-to-hand combat between warriors on horseback. This intense clash, while visually striking, also served a strategic purpose. It provided Ford the tactical break he needed. He ordered a detachment, led by Lieutenant Allison Nelson, to flank the Comanche position and cut off any potential routes of retreat. Ford then recalled the native allies to the village, in preparation for an all-out frontal assault on the Comanche. However, as with much of Ford's plan, things did not go as intended. A group of bloodthirsty Tonkawa, driven by deep hatred for the Comanche, could not be restrained and launched a premature attack. This action alerted Peta Nakona and his warriors to the Rangers' intentions. With their plan to draw attention away from their wives and children already accomplished, Peta Nakona realized there was no need to continue fighting. He ordered a retreat, leading his forces across the rolling hills, with the Tonkawa warriors in hot pursuit. Meanwhile, Ford received intelligence from a captured Comanche woman that a much larger camp lay several miles away, under the command of the feared and legendary Buffalo Hump. This was likely the destination for Peta Nakona and the other survivors. A much larger, deadlier counterattack was imminent. Realizing the situation was becoming untenable, Ford decided that a tactical withdrawal to Texas was his best option. He ordered the prisoners, 16 in total, to be shackled, the wounded placed in the ambulance, and waited for the Tonkawa pursuers to return. As the Tonkawa warriors straggled back into camp one by one, Ford observed something chilling. Their horses were laden with Comanche hands, feet, and strips of flesh, all fastened to their mounts, flapping in the wind. This gruesome sight spoke to the deep-seated hatred that fueled the brutal warfare on the plains. In total, 76 Comanche had been killed, with Ford losing only Private Nichols, a young ranger, and a young Waco warrior, who had been struck down in the one-on-one combat with a Comanche opponent. On May 13th, the combined force of Rangers and their native allies began their difficult trek back to the Brazos Agency, with their wounded and prisoners in tow. After days of harsh travel, they arrived on May 20th, greeted with widespread acclaim. Their return was hailed as a success, a tangible manifestation of the governor's new policies aimed at quelling the violence on the Texas frontier. Yet, despite the apparent victory, the war was far from over. Buffalo Hump and Peta Nacona were not defeated, and soon they would once again ride roughshod over the entire southern plains, reigniting the brutal conflict. Their retribution was swift, harsh, and all-encompassing. Peta Nacona, in particular, would continue to lead his people with relentless fury, determined to strike back at the settlers and those who had encroached on their land. In the years that followed, he would marry a woman named Cynthia Ann Parker, who had been captured during a raid, a symbol of the deep, complex relationships between the Comanche and the settlers they fought against. Together, Peta Nacona and Cynthia Ann Parker would have 3 children. Their son, Quanah Parker, would go on to become one of the most legendary and revered figures in Comanche history, ultimately serving as the last chief of the Comanche people. His leadership marked the final chapter of a proud and storied people's resistance against the forces that sought to destroy their way of life. But for tonight, those are stories for another time, another place. But what do you think? Was Rip Ford a skilled tactician, or was he simply a glory-hungry tyrant seeking personal recognition? Were the Comanche justified in the violence and scale of their raids, defending their land and way of life? And what about the Tonkawa? Were they right to seek such brutal revenge on their longtime enemies, the Comanche, after decades of suffering? We want to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and share your perspective. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Hit that notification bell, and we'll catch you next time for more stories from the past that still echo through today.